Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eunjung Cho. In an annual defense meeting, Washington and Seoul showed differences over defense burden sharing and intelligence pact with Japan. Amid great power competition, we look at how the 70-year-old security alliance between the U.S. and South Korea can evolve.
한미동맹은 강력한 힘을 바탕으로 한반도의 평화와 지역 안정을 위한 본연의 역할을 흔들림 없이
The only ones who benefit from expiration of Jisomia and continued friction between Seoul and Tokyo are Pyongyang and Beijing.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. O'Hanlon specializes on U.S. defense strategy and national security policy and authored numerous books. Also joining me, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner was CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Klingner, South Korean President Moon Jae-in, in essence, rejected Secretary Esper's calls to reconsider withdrawing from Jisomia. And if it expires within a week, what do you think will the backfire to the relationship between U.S. and South Korea?
Well, there are two levels to the agreement, both military and political. So military, it makes for a much more efficient transfer of military and intelligence information between South Korea and Japan against the common North Korean threat. It's like three outfielders in baseball being able to talk to each other to better facilitate either catching a fly ball or intercepting a missile, as well as other threats from North Korea. So that will make it less efficient in defending against North Korea. On a political level, it enables North Korea to drive a wedge between Washington and Seoul. It indicates that there's tension, there's disagreements amongst the allies, which is not something you want to do when you're facing an opponent like North Korea.
I think the greater of those two concerns probably is political, because it does make North Korea wonder if it can somehow drive this wedge between Washington and Seoul, between Seoul and Tokyo, for example, come up with an offer that deliberately snubs Japan on any discussion of the kidnapping issue or the medium-range missile threat issue, and see if you can divide South Korea from Japan. Even if that fails, it's something that North Korea might try, and we waste another year of potential negotiation time. More generally throughout the region, China could draw some of the same kinds of conclusions and try to split Japan from South Korea. And in fact, China probably has a halfway decent chance at pulling that off. We were just talking earlier that Korea is traditionally a little bit more wary of getting involved in issues in the South China Sea or in regard to Taiwan than the United States or Japan. It wants to protect a fairly positive relationship with China if possible. That's understandable, but it can be dangerous, especially if China senses an opportunity. So it's the political division between the allies that's really troublesome to me most of all. And I really hope South Korea and Japan can find a way to patch this up.
An even more contentious issue between the two sides was the talk over the burden sharing agreement. And before we delve into that issue, I did want to touch upon the United States' broader military strategy, because the latest national defense strategy that was released last year, it mentions about countering Russia and China, and also the role of its allies. So how does put us into perspective of U.S. asking for more roles by allies and in connection with this national defense strategy?
Well, I did not interpret the national defense strategy as signaling that we would ask South Korea for $5 billion a year in host nation support. I don't think one follows from the other. Obviously, President Trump is the head of his government, and he's the one who ultimately decides how we're going to handle that kind of a negotiation. The national defense strategy was much more a general view of changing strategic dynamics around the world that was spearheaded by Jim Mattis when he was Secretary of Defense. And sure, President Trump was aboard, but it really had Mattis's voice, in my view. And it was more about high-level strategic allocations of resources and assessment of threat than about something as frankly, mundane as host nation support negotiations. Now, Trump has found a way to make those negotiations anything but mundane because he actually seems to be putting some alliances at risk over these kinds of talks in a way that previous presidents had not. But the National Defense Strategy did not foreshadow this, I don't think.
How did you read it, the National Defense Strategy, in connection with the role of allies?
Well, I don't think it's as revolutionary a change as some are perceiving it to be. Similarly with the Obama administration's Asia pivot, it wasn't as overhyped and revolutionary. It's really a continuation of longstanding U.S. strategy and policy in Asia, which is a good thing. So we're trying to, as we have before, try to get allies to pay more, to do more. But South Korea, while it's hesitant to get involved in the South China Sea dispute now, in the past sent a very large contingent of soldiers to Vietnam during the Vietnam War, has been involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, anti-piracy operations off the Somali coast. So in a way, we're just trying to incorporate South Korea and other militarily capable allies in a policy towards maintaining sovereignty and peace and stability throughout Asia.
Then is a five-fold increase, as reported by the media, is that justifiable, do you think?
No, it's not. For years, the U.S. has said the cost of stationing U.S. forces overseas was in South Korea was $1.5 or $2 billion. During last year's negotiations, the president directed U.S. negotiators to do cost plus 50%, making a profit on stationing U.S. forces overseas. That's a break from post-World War II U.S. strategy. I think it's an insult to our men and women in uniform, and it's important to those of us who have children in the military. They didn't join to make money for the United States. They joined for principles and strategic objectives, which is what alliances should be about.
So the new costs include the costs for joint military trainings and maintaining strategic assets in Hawaii and Guam. So what is your take? Is it about including those in the cost for South Korea?
Well, I think President Trump should reread his own national defense strategy because that strategy says that we're focused on China and Russia. And so presumably assets in places like Guam should be interpreted largely in regard to what they would do to help us with a China threat and not exclusively or even primarily with a North Korea threat. So Bruce said it beautifully, and this is not what the United States is about in the international environment. It's one thing to, perpetrate the art of the deal, to try to get a little more help, to ask South Korea to nudge up its defense spending, which is already fairly impressive as a percent of GDP, to try to move things upward incrementally, that's okay. And that gives President Trump a talking point on the upcoming presidential campaign trail. He can do that with NATO, which is now spending 1.5% of GDP on average, used to be 1.4. That's the kind of progress you can expect. And that's the kind of progress previous American presidents and secretaries of defense have pursued, but in a more quiet, business-like, and courteous way.
Some are concerned that South Korea is now questioning the viability of alliance with the United States. So what do you think is the sentiment from the U.S. side as well and the South Korean side about the alliance?
Well, when I travel to Japan and South Korea, increasingly I'm hearing questions and concerns about the viability of the U.S. as an ally. They are concerned that the U.S. may not be there if either country faces a threat from China or North Korea. It's a cyclical concern. We hear ebbs and flows over the decades, but it's certainly that concern is rising. When the president unilaterally and surprisingly, announced a troop withdrawal from Syria, I heard from both South Korean and Japanese officials of, will we be next? Will you just decide to pull forces out or reduce forces to our surprise? A year ago, when President Trump announced the end of some military exercises in South Korea, that was without the coordination or notification of the Secretary of Defense, the Department of Defense, U.S. Forces Korea, South Korea, or Japan. So people are concerned about the arbitrary nature of U.S. policy.
And Mr. Ohan, the United States will have burden-sharing negotiations with Japan and Germany and NATO next year. South Korea being the first to negotiate, is South Korea in a disadvantage?
It's in a tough spot. I think President Trump's a hard guy to figure out, and you can never tell what kind of an issue he's just going to seize and really lock his teeth into and stick with. There are other issues where he stakes out a tough initial position and then tries to be amenable to compromise. This seems to be one that he just can't let go of. And so, I think South Korea is in a bit of a tough spot. And I share, again, all of Bruce's assessments. I don't really think South Korea or Japan wants to go it alone. I don't see them as reacting to President Trump by deciding, okay, let's abandon the alliance. That would be a fairly irrational act. But let's face it, President Trump makes people worry, and I think unnecessarily and counterproductively, because he doesn't just encourage them, our allies, to do more. The adversaries are listening too, and they're going to doubt if our commitment is quite as steadfast. If we still have troops in South Korea and Japan, it's a fundamentally different situation from, pulling out of part of Syria. But still, when you combine that decision in Syria with President Trump's rhetoric and his apparent disdain for alliances, you have to wonder what could come next, especially if he's reelected.
Well, both of you are raising a lot of concerns, but I do want to uplift the tone because even though President Trump may be tough to his allies, there are other military high-ranking officials who cherish the alliance.
Very much so. Remember, in 1976, Jimmy Carter campaigned on a platform. One of the tenets of the platform was to remove all U.S. forces from Korea, and then cooler heads and more experienced hands talked him out of that. So we're hoping that will be the case here. We can point out that when you compare South Korea to all the NATO allies, as a percentage of GDP, South Korea contributes more to its defense than every single NATO ally. So we need to distinguish South Korea's contribution to its own defense as well as paying a significant amount of the cost for U.S. forces stationed there.
Mm-hmm. Another important agenda was United States Indo-Pacific strategy. Do you think United States will rank and prioritize its allies depending on how much the ally contributes to United States Indo-Pacific strategy against China?
Well, let me start by ranking the alliances from my point of view. And I would put the U.S.-Korea and U.S.-Japan alliances as among the best alliances we have, certainly each one in the top 5. I might even make them my top 2. I think they're as impressive and as important for us as the U.S.-UK relationship or the U.S.-Canada relationship or any other that I can think of. South Korea, as Bruce says, perhaps has the most, has a very impressive percentage of GDP that it spends on its military, about 2.6%, I believe, and helps us with host nation support, and has combat-capable forces who are not afraid to fight and have proven that in the past. I think it's got one of the best militaries on the planet, probably top 5. And then Japan, of course, is the irreplaceable base from which we do everything in the region, everything from Korea, Taiwan Strait, all the way over to the Persian Gulf. So these two alliances are crucial. And the U.S.-Australia alliance is important too, but as we know, and if you look at a map, you see it, Australia is pretty far away from Asia. For Americans, at first glance, it's sort of over there too. It's down under, but it's pretty far away. So the ones that count, that are really in the crux of where we have our core interests, are really U.S.-Japan and U.S.-Korea.
And both of you have really emphasized how much South Korea is already contributing to the alliance. But given that the alliance was forged almost 70 years ago, and now the South Korea is a very wealthy country and geopolitics have changed, do you think somehow the alliance need to be reconstructed, to be reformed, or to evolve in any way?
I think it's always looking to evolve. And having South Korea participate in the Vietnam War and others activities beyond its horizon shows that it's a very capable military, as Mr. O'Hanlon said, and that it can do a lot. So it obviously has to be very sighted on the North Korean threat, but it has capabilities of doing other operations. Now, ranking our allies by how much they contribute, I mean, that's not how you treat your friends and your allies. It's like rating your children. They each have their own capabilities and their own limitations, and they have different missions, not your children, but allies. So Japan has a lot of self-imposed or externally imposed constraints on its military, but it is irreplaceable as not only an ally and a contributor to any kind of operations on the peninsula, but it does contribute in other ways as well.
The big decision is going to be if and when we ever get to peace in Korea. And I think we're quite a ways away from that, unfortunately. But at that point, we will have fundamental choices to make, and certainly if there were reunification. And we've both done some thinking and writing about this. I wrote an article last year in which I laid out 3 big choices for that world. One, South Korea could decide, or a reunified Korea could decide to abandon the alliance. And maybe that would be part of the negotiation even that led to reunification. A second choice would be sort of a lily pad kind of presence, regional peacekeeping training, a limited amount of expeditionary naval and air power, and maybe just 5,000 to 10,000 U.S. troops. And then a third choice would be somewhat like what we have today, with an eye on the China threat, to the extent that Korea thinks that China could be a direct threat to its own territory. So those are three big options for the alliance, and I think for Koreans in particular, if and when we get to reunification or at least lasting peace. But we're not there yet. So now we're at a point where we've got to evolve, stay up with the threat, and really build on the success of an alliance that's been really incredible for decades.
Well, on that note, we'll end this discussion here and watch video for our next discussion.
And as we consider adjusting, either dialing up or dialing down exercises, and as a means to keep the door open to diplomacy.
North Korea warned the United States would face a greater threat if it ignores the end-of-year deadline set by Chairman Kim. Pyongyang also says it is not interested in holding working-level talks in December unless Washington is ready to make substantial concessions. Now, Mr. Klingner, North Korea is releasing many statements day by day after the fall of the Stockholm talks. Is it eager to come back to the talks, do you think?
I don't think so. They said after the Stockholm negotiations that they didn't want to participate in any more of these disgusting negotiations unless the U.S. basically abandoned its position. And the U.S. position is compliant with the UN requirement that North Korea abandon its nuclear missile and BCW programs in a complete, verifiable, irreversible manner. So really, throughout this year, Kim Jong-un gave a speech earlier this year where he warned about this end-of-year deadline. And officials since then have been reminding us that they will engage in more dire, though unspecified, actions if we don't obey their demands.
Mm-hmm. North Korea's highest decision-making body, the State Affairs Committee, said that the United States will face greater threat and that North Korea will not hold to its commitment. So do you think North Korea may go ahead with the ICBM test and nuclear test once the New Year deadline expires next year?
I'm not sure they've decided, because that would certainly damage President Trump's position during an election year. And it would, of course, risk some escalation, at least a small possibility of war. And I'm not sure North Korea wants to do something that actively weakens President Trump. For one thing, they may not prefer the Democratic alternative. We'll have to see who that is and what their position is on Korea. Secondly, they probably don't want to anger President Trump if he may be in the White House for 5 more years. So I think stepping up to that kind of a decision will be pretty hard. They may do it, but there are counter-arguments. Mm-hmm. More likely, I believe, is that North Korea doesn't like seeing this issue relegated to the working level in the U.S. government, because in the U.S. government, as Mr. Klingner just said, we've got a stated policy essentially of complete denuclearization as a precondition for a normal relationship. President Trump, however, I believe, would do a deal short of that. Some people fear that Trump would go too easy on North Korea. I actually think that an interim deal is the most realistic and the correct goal, as opposed to instantaneous or rapid denuclearization, hook, line, and sinker.
Well, but do you think this is the time for a third summit with North Korea?
I don't think so. I'm more a believer in having actions taken at the working level to get the kind of detailed, comprehensive agreement that we really need to have. Similar to what we had with the arms control treaties with the Soviet Union, and I was a member of one of the negotiating delegations. One of the problems we've always had in the previous agreements with North Korea, other than North Korea never complied or cheated, was that they were very short, very vague, a lot of loopholes. They didn't really even define the objectives, let alone the actions by all parties. That's the kind of thing you need at the working level. But North Korea doesn't want to do that. They want to go right to Trump because they see him as more likely to offer concessions, as he did in Singapore.
Mm-hmm. So after the year-end deadline, if North Korea conducts ICBM nuclear tests, what is the likely response from the United States?
Well, I think before they go to that, which would really be crossing a line, a red line, I think they're going to go up the escalation ladder. They've gotten really U.S. acceptance of short-range violations of UN resolutions. They've gotten U.S. acceptance of medium-range violations, 24 violations of UN resolutions this year. That's tied for the record in a year. They could go to land-based medium range, intermediate launched over Japan. And they also tend to do it slowly, like, I'm about to do something bad, but you could buy me back from that. So I don't think it will be a jump to the nuke or missile test. Now, in the U.S., the largest proponents for the fire and fury preventive attack that the president was talking about were the National Security Advisors, H.R. McMaster and then John Bolton. With them gone, I don't think there's a big proponent for resuming that kind of threats. My concern is that Trump is more likely to accept a bad deal but claim it's a great success.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. O'Hanlon, the fact that North Korea is emphasizing the year-end deadline so much, is this a show of desperation that it wants the sanctions relief soon?
Well, it certainly is feeling the heat. And I think we need to bear in mind, because it's often said in Washington policy circles that the sanctions have essentially collapsed. I don't think that's true. They certainly are being challenged and in some cases evaded. But the best data that I've seen on the North Korean economy is that even though it's holding up somewhat, and when you go to Pyongyang, you see some activity in consumer goods and so forth, that there have been real declines in the GDP each of the last 2 years, 3 or 4%. And so I think North Korea does need sanctions relief. But I also think they're calculating, in the way that Bruce Klingner just said, they're calculating how do they provoke enough to get more presidential attention. In a way, I see this as part of a negotiation more than a separate military track.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Klingner, before we go, the chief negotiator Kim Myung-gil said that North Korea is not interested in the end of war declaration or the liaison office. So with that in mind, how can the United States strategize in negotiations with North Korea going forward?
Well, North Korea has a long list of demands, but they tend to highlight one at a time as the most important. So over time, we've seen that sanctions relief is the most important. Then they say, no, it's a security guarantee, even though they've gotten 23 or more of those. And then it's end of war. So everything always is in constant flux. I think another important point is that the North Korean official media referenced the 2020 presidential election. I don't remember them doing that in the past. So President Trump has said his relationship with Kim is the biggest foreign policy accomplishment of his administration. So North Korea may be sort of doing like a Chicago gangster. Nice re-election campaign you got there going, Mr. President. Shame if something were to break. A shame if something were to get interesting and tension rising. You probably don't want that to happen and undermine your claims of success, so you'd better give us what we want.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to leave it there and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of a North Korean fishing vessel where 2 North Korean fishermen supposedly killed 16 other crew members. South Korea's Unification Ministry released this photo to the media. South Korea blindfolded the 2 fishermen and handed them over to the North Korean soldiers at the DMZ. Human rights groups and South Korea's opposition party condemned the latest action by Seoul government. Mr. Klingner?
It's a very odd case. The story coming from South Korea is that the 2 officials murdered their compatriots over a period of time. And on this very small ship, it's very unlikely that 2 people at a time would come on deck to be murdered, and then more time would pass for 2 more and 2 more and 2 more. I think it's something that we need to really look into, not only the North Korean actions, but also South Korea is repatriating them, likely against their will.
Mm-hmm. Mr. O'Hanlon?
I can't add to that. That's pretty good analysis. Mm-hmm. Let's not take anybody at their word just yet on this.
Right, we'll leave it there. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Klingner, Mr. O'Hanlon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.